Yesterday we talked about some imaginary globe lines that run across the earth that help us to split the earth into different sections. And we talked about the equator and the prime meridian, and that both of those split the earth in half and to make the hemispheres. So let's take another look at the equator. The equator is the line that runs at 0 degrees latitude around the center of the earth, and it splits the earth into the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. And then we also talked about the prime meridian, and the prime meridian runs from the North Pole to the South Pole, and it's located at 0 degrees longitude. So since it's running from the North Pole to the South Pole, it splits the Earth into the Eastern Hemisphere and the Western Hemisphere. So we're going to take a look at some different views of the Earth and see how these hemispheres help to divide the Earth. Right, so take a look here. You've got the northern hemisphere, the southern hemisphere, the western hemisphere, and the eastern hemisphere. And you see on each of these maps, there are large masses of land called continents. And on the earth, there are 7 large land masses that make up the continents. Those are Africa. We can see Africa down here in the eastern hemisphere. You can also see that Africa is right here in the southern hemisphere. It also has a part in the northern hemisphere and the western hemisphere. So Africa is actually part of the continent, is located in all 4 of the hemispheres. Another continent is Antarctica. So here we have Antarctica, which is commonly known as the South Pole. So of course it's going to be in the southern hemisphere. Next we have Asia. We can see Asia here in the northern hemisphere. And Asia is also located in the eastern hemisphere. Australia is another continent. Here we see Australia in the southern hemisphere, and Australia down here in the eastern hemisphere. Europe, here's the continent of Europe. It's in the western hemisphere, but there's also a part of Europe in the eastern hemisphere. And then we can also find Europe right here above Africa in the northern hemisphere. So it's in 3 of the 4 hemispheres or halves of the earth. And we go on to North America, where we live. North America is the continent that the United States is a part of. We see North America. Obviously, the name North would tell us that it's most likely going to be in the northern hemisphere, and that is true. North America is in the northern hemisphere and in the western hemisphere here. So we can say that we live in both the northern hemisphere and the western hemisphere. We're in the north half of the globe above the equator, and also in the western half of the globe west of the prime meridian. And then the last of the continents is South America. So you would expect South America to be in the south hemisphere, which part of it is. But part of South America is also in the northern hemisphere. And we also find South America in the western hemisphere. So you can tell by this that continents are in more than one hemisphere. Those of us living in North America, which is all of us in our classroom, we live in the northern hemisphere and the western hemisphere. But we also talked about, very first, we talked about Africa, which is actually part of the continent of Africa, is in all 4 of the hemispheres. So remember that the northern and southern hemispheres are created by the equator that runs around the earth. North of the equator is the northern hemisphere, and south of the equator makes the southern hemisphere. And then the prime meridian is that imaginary line running from the North Pole to the South Pole at 0 degrees longitude, and it creates the western hemisphere and the eastern hemisphere. So I want you today to use your maps to very carefully answer the questions about the different hemispheres, the continents, and it's also going to ask you some questions about the oceans. But all of the questions can be answered by looking at the maps which are provided for you at the top of your questions. So be very careful as you're answering your questions. Look for the ones that have more than one answer, that you have check boxes. Don't let those trick you. And if you have any questions, send me a private comment on your Google Classroom. You can email me or have your parents dojo me. Hope you have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow.